The millionaire's son crossed a line that day, leaving teeth marks on the innocent maid's arm. What followed was a chain of events that nobody in the mansion could have predicted, revealing a truth that would change their lives forever. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. The cries echoed through the grand hall of the Smith estate, bouncing off marble floors and crystal chandeliers that hung like frozen tears from the vaulted ceiling. The peaceful afternoon had shattered in an instant. Young Michael Smith, a frail 7-year-old with hollow cheeks and distant eyes, clung to the arm of Sarah Johnson, his teeth pressed deep into her flesh. Blood trickled down her wrist, staining the crisp white cuff of her uniform. "Oh my God! Someone help!" Mary's voice cut through the chaos as the longtime cook rushed from the kitchen. Flour-covered hands pressed against her cheeks in horror. She'd worked for the Smith family for over 15 years, but nothing had prepared her for this scene. "Somebody call Mr. Smith right now!" Sarah remained eerily still, her face twisted in pain but her body frozen, as though any movement might worsen the situation. The young maid had only been employed at the mansion for 3 days, hired specifically because of her experience with special needs children. But this violent outburst hadn't been mentioned in her interview. "Michael, sweetheart," she whispered, fighting to keep her voice steady despite the searing pain. "It's okay." Near the doorway, Robert hesitated, 1 foot forward and 1 back. The family chauffeur had driven Michael to countless therapy appointments over the past year, witnessing the boy's silent suffering from a distance. He took another cautious step, only to freeze when the child released a guttural growl that seemed to emanate from somewhere primal and wounded. "Don't," Sarah warned the chauffeur softly. "Please, stay back." Michael's eyes flashed with a desperate fury that none of the staff understood. The kind of rage that can only come from a place of profound hurt. His small fingers dug into Sarah's arm with surprising strength for such a tiny frame, and his teeth remained clenched as though he'd found something to anchor him in a world that had become unbearable. The mansion fell silent, except for the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner, and Michael's ragged breathing. The staff exchanged helpless glances, paralyzed by the bizarre tableau before them. Since his mother's tragic death, the boy had retreated into silence, but this was something entirely new and frightening. "Should I call an ambulance?" Mary whispered, her voice trembling. Sarah shook her head slightly, her eyes never leaving Michael's. "Just get Mr. Smith," she murmured. "Please." The desperation in the child's eyes told a story no one had been able to read until now. A story of loss and confusion too complex for his 7 years to process or express in any way except this desperate, violent plea for someone, anyone, to understand. Sarah Johnson remained perfectly still on the cold, tiled floor of the Smith mansion, blood trickling down her arm where Michael's teeth had broken the skin. Despite the sharp pain radiating through her wrist, she didn't flinch or cry out. Instead, she gently placed her free hand on the boy's trembling back, her touch light as a feather. "Breathe with me, Michael," she whispered, her voice quivering but deliberately soft. "In and out, just like this." She demonstrated with an exaggerated breath, her eyes never leaving his. Mary rushed around them in a frenzy, her hands flailing as she shouted for someone to call Mr. Smith immediately. The cook's panic only seemed to intensify the situation, making Michael's grip tighten further. "For heaven's sake, get him off her!" Mary exclaimed, reaching for the telephone. "He could have rabies or something." Sarah shook her head slightly, maintaining her focus on the frightened child. "Please, everyone stay back," she requested, her calm voice creating a stark contrast to the chaos surrounding them. "He's scared, not dangerous." The young maid shifted slightly, wincing as Michael's teeth remained embedded in her flesh, but her expression remained gentle. "It's all right, Michael. Just let me talk to you for a moment. I'm not angry, and I'm not going anywhere." Robert stood frozen by the doorway, watching the scene unfold with wide eyes. The chauffeur had seen the boy's previous outbursts, but nothing like this. Nothing so desperate and raw. Yet something about Sarah's approach seemed different from the parade of specialists who had tried and failed to connect with the 7-year-old. Should I call for an ambulance? Robert asked uncertainly, his keys jingling nervously in his hand. Sarah shook her head again, her attention never wavering from Michael. No ambulance, no sudden movements, just give us space. The mansion's grand hall fell into a hushed silence as Sarah continued to speak to Michael in hushed, gentle tones. Her words weren't clinical or condescending like the therapists who had come before. They were simple, honest, and filled with a compassion that seemed to reach beyond the boy's defenses. "I know you're trying to tell me something important," she murmured, "and I'm listening. I promise I'm listening." Something in her voice, perhaps its sincerity or the absence of fear, seemed to penetrate the fog of Michael's distress. The staff watched in astonishment as the tension in the boy's small body began to ease ever so slightly. Sarah's compassion had accomplished what 6 months of professional therapy couldn't. It had created a moment of connection. Every person in that room, from Mary with her hand still on the telephone to Robert by the door, found themselves drawn to the extraordinary scene unfolding before them. A wounded maid and a wounded child finding understanding in the most unexpected way. Mary's hands flew to her face, her years of experience in the Smith household suddenly seeming inadequate. "Talk to him? He doesn't even speak," she exclaimed, her voice carrying across the mansion's grand hall. The cook's disbelief was palpable as she exchanged glances with Robert, who stood frozen by the doorway, uncertain whether to approach or retreat. But Sarah Johnson remained focused solely on the troubled child before her. Her eyes never left Michael's, searching for the pain she recognized from her own difficult past, pain that went deeper than any physical wound. The young woman's wrist continued to bleed where the boy's teeth had broken skin, but she showed no concern for her injury. "Everyone, please step back," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible, yet somehow commanding the room. The staff reluctantly created space around them, the tension thick enough to touch. Michael's small body trembled, his grip on Sarah's arm still tight, though his eyes now showed confusion rather than rage. The 7-year-old's breathing came in short, panicked bursts, as tears streamed down his pale cheeks. Sarah pressed her free hand to her chest, her voice gentle as morning light. "I know you're hurting inside. I feel it too. But I'm not angry at you." She spoke as if they were alone in the vast mansion, her words meant only for him. Sometimes our hearts hurt so much that our bodies don't know what to do with all that pain. The maid slowly extended her fingers toward Michael's face, not quite touching him, but offering connection. "You don't need to use your teeth to tell me you're scared. I can see it in your eyes." Michael's gaze flickered between Sarah's face and her injured arm. For the first time since the incident began, uncertainty replaced rage in his expression. His jaw began to loosen, the pressure on Sarah's skin gradually easing. "That's it," she encouraged softly. "Just breathe with me." From the staircase, unseen by those below, John Smith watched in stunned silence, his knuckles white against the polished banister. Beside him, Jennifer Davis observed with narrowed eyes, her professional assessment at odds with the scene unfolding below. Michael's small fingers uncurled one by one from Sarah's arm, leaving angry red marks where they had gripped so desperately. The boy's shoulders slumped as the fight drained from his body, replaced by exhaustion and something that looked remarkably like relief. "You're safe here," Sarah whispered, still not touching him, but remaining steadfastly present. "And I'm not going anywhere." As Michael Smith's grip loosened, the grand hall of the estate fell into a silence so profound it seemed to swallow every breath. The marble floors, the ornate furnishings, the high ceilings, all faded into insignificance as everyone present focused on the frail 7-year-old and the maid whose arms still bore the imprint of his teeth. For several heartbeats, no one moved, as if the slightest disturbance might shatter this fragile moment of connection. Then, without warning, Michael collapsed against Sarah Johnson's chest, his small body convulsed with sobs that seemed to emerge from somewhere deep and untouched. These weren't the wild, empty wails that had occasionally echoed through the mansion since his mother's death. These were different, raw, vulnerable, and achingly human. They were the cries of a child who had been drowning in silence and had finally found a lifeline. Sarah instinctively wrapped her arms around him, her own tears falling freely onto his sandy-colored hair. "It's over now," she whispered, her voice barely audible, yet somehow filling the room. "I'm here with you." Her wounded arm still throbbed, but she paid it no mind, focusing entirely on the boy who trembled against her. Mary stood frozen by the doorway, her mouth slightly open, unable to process what she was witnessing. In all her years working for the Smith family, she had never seen Michael connect with anyone this way, not since the tragic accident. The cook's hands, usually so busy and purposeful, hung limply at her sides as she watched the scene unfold with disbelief etched across her weathered features. Robert, the family chauffeur, remained near the entrance, his tall frame leaning slightly against the doorjamb for support. He raised a hand to his face, surprised to find moisture on his cheeks. The stoic man quickly wiped away tears he hadn't realized he'd shed, embarrassed by his emotional response, yet unable to look away from the profound transformation happening before him. In that moment, something fundamental shifted in the atmosphere of the Smith estate. The mansion, which had for so long been shrouded in grief and silence, seemed to exhale, as if the building itself had been holding its breath alongside its inhabitants. Michael's sobs gradually softened into gentle hiccups as he nestled closer to Sarah, his small fingers clutching the fabric of her uniform like a lifeline. No one spoke. No one needed to. The connection between the autistic boy and the compassionate maid transcended words, reaching into a place where understanding required no language, only presence, patience, and an open heart. John Smith stood paralyzed at the top of the grand mahogany staircase, his knuckles white against the polished banister. From this vantage point, he had witnessed everything: the bite, the blood, and now this impossible moment of connection. His chest tightened as he watched his son sobbing in the arms of a woman he'd hired just 3 days ago. For 18 months since the accident, John had lived in a mansion filled with ghosts. His wife's absence haunted every room, but Michael's emotional disappearance had been the cruelest blow. The vibrant, laughing boy had vanished the day his mother's car went off the bridge, replaced by a shell who flinched at touch and screamed at comfort. "We've tried everything, Mr. Smith," countless specialists had told him, their voices eventually blending into one resigned chorus. 6 different therapists, each more qualified than the last, had attempted to reach Michael. One left with bite marks similar to Sarah's. Another quit after Michael had thrown a paperweight at her head. The most recent, a celebrated child psychologist from Boston, had lasted 8 sessions before declaring Michael's case extraordinarily challenging. Yet there, Sarah Johnson knelt on his imported marble floor, her uniform sleeves soaked with blood, cradling his son as if she'd known him forever. The wealthy businessman felt something crack inside his chest, something between hope and terror. Hope that his son might return to him, terror that this fragile moment would shatter like everything else. John ran his fingers through his graying hair, remembering how he'd barely glanced at Sarah's application. The agency had sent her as a temporary replacement when their regular service couldn't provide staff. He'd noted only that she had no experience in homes like his, no impressive references from wealthy families. What he couldn't see on paper was her capacity for compassion, the way she'd instinctively known not to pull away from Michael's desperate act, the gentle words she'd offered when others would have screamed. Below, his son's sobs were quieting. Michael's small hand now rested against Sarah's cheek, the first voluntary touch he'd initiated since the funeral. John felt tears threatening, but he blinked them back. Emotion was a luxury he'd denied himself for too long. He took one step down, then another. Whatever was happening between the maid and his son felt sacred, dangerous, and precious all at once. For the first time in 18 months, John allowed himself to feel something beyond grief, a tentative, fragile hope that perhaps his broken family might somehow begin to heal. Impossible. It could never be like that. The words sliced through the air like ice. John Smith turned to find Jennifer Davis standing at his side, her professional demeanor barely concealing her disbelief. The child therapist he'd hired 6 months ago watched the scene below with narrowed eyes, her clipboard clutched tightly against her chest. For half a year, she had tried everything with Michael. Specialized techniques, carefully structured sessions, methodical approaches, all with minimal progress. "What do you mean?" John asked, his voice barely above a whisper. His gaze returned to the floor below where his son remained nestled against Sarah's shoulder, calmer than he'd seen him in years. Jennifer leaned closer, her perfume mingling with the scent of clinical antiseptic that always seemed to follow her. "Something's off here, John. A child with Michael's level of autism doesn't simply change overnight. This isn't normal behavior. It's concerning." "But he's responding to her," John countered, gesturing toward the maid who continued to hold his son with such natural ease. "Look at him." The therapist placed a manicured hand on his arm. "That's precisely what worries me. I've spent months building trust with him through evidence-based methods. Then this woman arrives, and suddenly he's having an emotional breakthrough? It defies everything we know about autism spectrum disorders." John's chest tightened as he watched Sarah gently stroke Michael's hair. The boy had stopped crying now, his breathing steady against her shoulder. For the first time since losing his wife, hope had blossomed in his heart. A fragile, tentative hope that perhaps his son might find his way back from the darkness. "Maybe we've been approaching this all wrong," he suggested, not taking his eyes off Michael. Jennifer's grip on his arm tightened slightly. "Or maybe there's something else happening here that we're not seeing. I'm concerned about what this means for his treatment plan. Emotional volatility can be extremely damaging for children like Michael." The mansion fell silent, except for the soft murmurs between Sarah and the boy. John found himself caught in an impossible position, torn between the miracle unfolding before his eyes and the professional warnings of the woman he'd paid thousands to help his son. "Just be careful," Jennifer whispered, her voice taking on a concerned tone that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Sometimes things aren't what they seem. I've seen cases where sudden changes like this led to severe regression later. I'd hate to see Michael hurt even more." The weight of fatherhood had never felt heavier as he watched his son cling to a woman who was practically a stranger, while the expert he'd trusted stood beside him, sounding warning bells he couldn't ignore. Jennifer Davis leaned closer to John Smith, her designer perfume mingling with the scent of his expensive cologne. She could have provoked him on purpose, to make herself look like a savior, she whispered, her voice barely audible. "It's a classic manipulation technique. I've seen it before in my practice." John bristled, his shoulders tensing beneath his tailored suit. The suggestion seemed preposterous. Why would anyone deliberately antagonize a vulnerable child? Yet, as he watched Sarah from across the room, doubt crept in like an unwelcome shadow. The therapist's credentials were impeccable. She'd worked with dozens of children like Michael. Perhaps her professional instincts were detecting something his desperate hope had blinded him to. "I just find it convenient," Jennifer continued, adjusting her glasses with manicured fingers. 6 months of professional therapy yielded nothing, yet this maid manages a breakthrough in one day? she let the implication hang in the air between them. The seed of doubt took root in John's mind, despite his resistance. He'd hired and fired countless employees over the years. Reading people was part of his success, but grief had clouded his judgment before. The memory of his late wife made his chest tighten. What would Jennifer have thought of all this? Meanwhile, across the mansion's spacious living room, Sarah Johnson sat cross-legged on the plush carpet beside Michael. From her apron pocket, she pulled out a set of handmade flashcards, simple drawings on cardstock, colored with what looked like ordinary markers. "I made these last night," she told the boy softly, arranging them in a semicircle before him. "This one's a red heart. This is a happy face. Here's a sad face. And look, a house and a car." Michael's eyes, usually distant and unfocused, tracked the movement of her hands. The room fell silent as Sarah patiently waited, making no demands, applying no pressure. Robert, the chauffeur, paused in the doorway, transfixed by the scene. For several long moments, nothing happened. Then, with trembling fingers, Michael reached out and touched the red heart card. His small hand hovered over it before picking it up entirely. A shy nod followed, his eyes briefly meeting Sarah's before darting away. Mary gasped from the kitchen doorway, her hand flying to her mouth. In the 2 years since his mother's death, Michael had never willingly engaged with any therapeutic tools. The cook crossed herself silently, tears welling in her eyes. From across the room, Jennifer watched the interaction, her professional smile firmly in place. But behind her composed exterior, jealousy burned bright and dangerous, her fingers tightening around her leather-bound notebook until her knuckles turned white. A small, hesitant smile broke across Michael Smith's face, the first genuine expression of joy anyone had seen from him in years. The simple gesture transformed his features, bringing light to eyes that had remained dull since his mother's passing. Mary, who had worked for the Smith family for over a decade, crossed herself instinctively, her weathered hands trembling as she whispered a prayer of gratitude. The cook's eyes welled with tears as she watched the scene unfold in the grand hall of the mansion. "Sweet Jesus," she murmured, clutching her apron. "It's a miracle." Robert stood nearby, wiping his eyes with his uniform sleeve. The chauffeur had driven Michael to countless therapy appointments over the past year, witnessing the boy's silent suffering on each journey. Now, seeing the child respond to Sarah, the emotion overwhelmed him. "I never thought I'd see the day," he said softly, his voice catching. From the staircase, Jennifer Davis observed the scene with a very different reaction. The child therapist's professional smile had vanished, replaced by tightly pressed lips and narrowed eyes. 6 months of meticulous work, specialized techniques, careful documentation, and endless patience had yielded nothing but frustrated silence from the boy. Her credentials and experience meant nothing in the face of what was happening before her. The therapist gripped the banister, knuckles whitening as Sarah Johnson showed Michael another flashcard. The maid's simple, homemade tools seemed laughably amateur compared to Jennifer's expensive, professionally designed materials. Yet the boy was responding, choosing cards and making eye contact, achievements that had eluded Jennifer's expert approach for half a year. "Beginner's luck," she whispered to herself, though deep down she knew it was something more. The connection between the new maid and Michael was undeniable, authentic in a way that made her elaborate therapeutic strategies seem hollow. Jennifer watched as John Smith descended the stairs, his face alight with hope as he observed his son's transformation. The wealthy man's attention was fixed entirely on Sarah and Michael, not even noticing the therapist standing mere feet away. As the household staff gathered around the pair, exclaiming over each small response from Michael, Jennifer felt herself fading into the background, becoming irrelevant in the very home where she had once been the authority on the boy's care. Her frustration crystallized into something darker, more dangerous. 6 months of failure against 1 day of success. The injustice of it burned within her. igniting a resolve that would soon cast shadows over the momentary happiness filling the Smith estate. "I've been working with children on the autism spectrum for 15 years, John," Jennifer Davis said, leaning forward in the leather armchair across from his desk. Her credentials from Harvard hung prominently on the wall behind him, a constant reminder of her expertise. What happened today simply doesn't align with established patterns of behavior. John Smith stared out the window of his study, watching as Sarah walked Michael through the garden below. His son was pointing at something, actually pointing, a gesture he hadn't made in nearly 2 years. "But you saw it yourself," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. He responded to her. Jennifer adjusted her glasses, her lips pressed into a thin line. "That's precisely what concerns me. I've spent 6 months building trust with Michael through evidence-based therapeutic approaches. Then this woman arrives with no training whatsoever, and suddenly he's communicating? It raises serious red flags." The therapist placed a folder on John's mahogany desk, sliding it toward him with manicured fingers. "These are my session notes. Progress with children like Michael is measured in tiny increments over long periods. What you witnessed today defies everything we know about childhood trauma combined with autism spectrum disorder." John flipped through the meticulously documented pages, each one detailing his son's resistance to connection. The weight of hope and doubt pressed against his chest like a stone. "What are you suggesting?" he asked. "I'm not suggesting anything definitive," Jennifer replied, her tone softening. "But as a professional, I must advise caution. Sometimes people with ulterior motives know exactly how to manipulate situations to appear heroic." Outside, Michael had stopped to examine a butterfly on Sarah's outstretched hand. The sight made John's throat tighten. "She's just a maid," he murmured, more to himself than to Jennifer. "Exactly," she responded, "which makes her sudden breakthrough with your son all the more suspicious. Have you verified her background thoroughly? Her references?" The question hung in the air between them. John ran his hand through his graying hair, exhaustion evident in the slump of his shoulders. Since losing his wife, every decision felt like navigating a minefield. One wrong step could shatter what little remained of his family. "I want to believe this is real," he admitted. "You have no idea how much I want that." Jennifer nodded sympathetically. "Of course you do. Any father would. That's why it's my responsibility to ensure no one takes advantage of that desire." She gathered her notes, sliding them back into her leather portfolio. "Just promise me you'll proceed with caution." As she left, John remained at the window, watching his son, smiling, engaged, present for the first time in years. His heart ached with a desperate, fragile hope that warred against the seeds of doubt Jennifer had so carefully planted. Later that afternoon, Sarah Johnson excused herself to fetch a glass of water for Michael. The boy had been making remarkable progress, pointing to the red heart card repeatedly with a shy smile that melted everyone's heart. As Sarah stepped away, Jennifer Davis saw her opportunity. With practiced subtlety, the therapist glanced around the room. Robert was polishing the car keys by the window, while Mary had retreated to the kitchen to prepare dinner. John Smith had disappeared into his office to handle some urgent business calls. The moment was perfect. "We just need patience with special children," Jennifer announced to no one in particular, her voice carrying just enough professional authority as she casually swept the colorful flashcards into her designer handbag. Her smile remained fixed, betraying nothing of the jealousy burning inside her. When Sarah returned with the water, Michael reached for his beloved cards, his fingers searching the empty table. His eyes widened as he realized they were missing. The 7-year-old looked up at Sarah with confusion, then began frantically scanning the room. "Michael, what's wrong?" Sarah knelt beside him, setting down the glass. The boy's breathing quickened as he pointed desperately at the empty space where the cards had been. "Oh, the flashcards?" Sarah looked around, puzzled. "They were right here." Jennifer stood back, arms crossed. Perhaps he needs to learn that objects aren't permanent. It's an important developmental lesson. Michael's search grew more frantic. He dropped to his knees, looking under furniture, his movements becoming increasingly erratic. His fingers trembled as he pushed aside cushions and books. "This isn't right," Sarah whispered, helping him look. Those cards were special to him. The boy began rocking back and forth, a low moan escaping his lips. The sound grew louder, transforming into guttural cries that echoed through the mansion. His small body tensed as distress overtook him completely. "Michael, sweetheart, will find them," Sarah promised, but the child was beyond consolation now. Jennifer watched with calculated concern, her handbag clutched tightly against her side. "This is exactly what I warned about," she said loudly enough for Robert to hear. Temporary connections can trigger severe regression in children with his condition. As Michael's distress escalated, Sarah tried desperately to calm him, offering alternative toys and gentle words. But the boy was inconsolable, his progress seemingly erased in moments. From the doorway, John Smith watched helplessly, torn between the miracle he'd witnessed earlier and the heartbreaking scene before him now. The seed of doubt Jennifer had planted began to take root. Sarah Johnson knelt beside Michael Smith, her hands trembling as she tried to soothe him. The boy's distress escalated by the second, his small body quivering with anxiety after discovering his precious flashcards had vanished. "Michael, please, it's okay. We can make new ones together," she whispered, but her gentle words couldn't penetrate his growing panic. The 7-year-old's breathing became erratic, his eyes wide with terror. Before Sarah could react, Michael lurched forward, slamming his forehead against the wall with a sickening thud. A primal scream tore from his throat, not the tantrum of a spoiled child, but the raw anguish of someone whose fragile world had crumbled yet again. "Stop, please!" Sarah reached for him, tears streaming down her face as she tried to pull him away from the wall. Blood trickled from a small cut on his forehead, each crimson drop breaking her heart further. Jennifer Davis stood in the doorway, her professional demeanor perfectly intact despite the chaos. Only the slight upturn at the corner of her mouth betrayed her satisfaction as she watched the scene unfold. The therapist's eyes remained cold and calculating, a stark contrast to her voice, which dripped with manufactured concern. "Everyone, step back," Jennifer commanded, sweeping into the room with practiced authority. The staff immediately obeyed, creating space around the distraught child and the desperate maid. Jennifer pointed an accusing finger at Sarah. "See what's happened? She's made things worse." Her voice carried through the mansion's grand hall, ensuring everyone heard. This is exactly what happens when untrained people try to handle complex psychological conditions. Mary clutched her apron, her earlier warmth towards Sarah now replaced with uncertainty. Robert, who had witnessed Michael's breakthrough with Sarah just days before, now shifted uncomfortably, doubt clouding his judgment. "I didn't," Sarah began, but her protest was drowned out by Michael's continued wailing. "His routine was stable before you started interfering," Jennifer continued, her voice carrying just enough professional weight to sound authoritative. "Now look at him." The staff exchanged worried glances. Whispers rippled through the gathered household employees, the gardener, the housekeeper, even the weekend butler who rarely spoke. "I heard she's not even qualified to work with children," someone murmured. "Maybe she's just after Mr. Smith's money," another voice added. Sarah felt their suspicion like a physical weight pressing down on her shoulders. She continued holding Michael, rocking him gently as his sobs gradually quieted. But the damage was done. The seeds of doubt Jennifer had carefully planted were now blooming into full-blown suspicion, and Sarah found herself increasingly alone in the sprawling mansion that had briefly felt like home. The next morning, whispers slithered through the corridors of the Smith mansion like a poisonous fog. Jennifer Davis had been busy. Standing in the kitchen, with a concerned expression perfectly crafted for deception, she leaned toward Mary as the cook prepared breakfast. "I've seen how Sarah Johnson looks at Mr. Smith," Jennifer murmured, her voice low enough to seem confidential, yet loud enough for Robert to overhear as he collected the car keys. "Don't you think it's strange how quickly she appeared after Mrs. Smith passed away?" Mary's wooden spoon hesitated over the oatmeal. She'd worked for the family for 11 years and considered herself a good judge of character. Yet doubt crept in like an unwelcome chill. "Sarah seems genuine with the boy," Mary offered weakly. Jennifer shook her head. "That's the most disturbing part. Using a disabled child to get close to a wealthy widower? I've seen this pattern before in my professional experience." By lunchtime, the rumors had reached every corner of the estate. The gardener avoided eye contact with Sarah as she crossed the lawn. The housekeeper suddenly remembered urgent duties whenever Sarah entered a room. Even Robert, who had wiped away tears at Michael's breakthrough, now watched her with guarded suspicion. Sarah felt the change immediately. The mansion that had begun to feel like a place of purpose now seemed vast and hostile. When she entered the kitchen to prepare Michael's lunch, Mary turned her back, busying herself with pots that didn't need cleaning. "Is everything all right?" Sarah asked, reaching for an apple from the fruit bowl. "Just fine," Mary replied curtly, her usual warmth absent. "Mr. Smith asked that Jennifer supervise Michael's lunch today. Professional guidance," he said. Sarah's hand froze mid-air. "But Michael has been doing so well with our routine." Mary's shoulders stiffened. "Well, some of us have actual qualifications, don't we?" The words stung like a slap. Sarah retreated to the staff quarters, where she found her few personal items had been moved to a corner, as if contaminated. A photograph of her mother sat face down on the nightstand. Through the window, she watched Jennifer walking with John Smith across the garden, her hand occasionally touching his arm in practiced sympathy. Michael trailed behind them, his eyes scanning the grounds as if searching for someone. For Sarah, the isolation pressed down on her like a physical weight. In just 24 hours, the fragile connections she'd built had unraveled. The only person who still seemed to need her was Michael, and now even that relationship was being systematically severed by Jennifer's calculating hands. On Thursday morning, the atmosphere in the Smith mansion hung heavy with tension. John Smith summoned Sarah Johnson to his office, his voice carrying an unusual edge when he called through the intercom. Sarah's stomach knotted as she made her way down the long corridor, past Mary, who averted her eyes, and Robert, who offered only the faintest sympathetic nod. The office door stood partially open. Sarah knocked gently before entering the mahogany-paneled room where John sat behind his imposing desk. His face was a mask of controlled emotion. "Close the door," he instructed, his voice deliberately measured. When Sarah complied, he reached into his desk drawer and withdrew a small velvet box. Opening it with deliberate slowness, he revealed a delicate gold bracelet with intricate filigree work. The jewelry caught the morning light, streaming through the window, casting tiny reflections across the room. "Do you recognize this?" John asked, his tone icy. Sarah's eyes widened. She shook her head, genuinely confused. "No, sir, I've never seen it before." John's expression hardened. "Jennifer found it in your uniform pocket yesterday when the laundry was being done. She brought it to me immediately." The color drained from Sarah's face. "Mr. Smith, I swear I've never seen that bracelet. I would never—" "It belonged to my late wife," John interrupted, his voice cracking slightly. "One of the few pieces I kept in her sanctuary after the accident." Sarah felt the room spinning. "Sir, please believe me, I didn't take it." "I wouldn't." John studied her face, searching for deception. The trust they'd built over Michael's breakthrough now balanced on a knife's edge. He wanted to believe her, the woman who had somehow reached his son when no one else could, but the evidence seemed irrefutable. Jennifer suggested you might have taken a liking to it while cleaning, he continued, watching her reaction closely. She said you've been admiring the jewelry collection. I've never even entered your wife's sanctuary, Sarah protested, her voice trembling. The only rooms I clean are the ones Mary assigned me. Tears welled in her eyes, but she fought them back. She thought of Michael, of the connection they'd formed, of the trust she'd earned. Now it was all crumbling because of an accusation she couldn't defend against. John sighed heavily, closing the velvet box with a snap. I need time to consider what happens next. Your position here is uncertain. Sarah nodded, her throat too tight for words. As she turned to leave, John added, For Michael's sake, I hope there's an explanation. She closed the door behind her, leaning against it momentarily to steady herself. Down the hall, Jennifer Davis stood watching, her professional smile barely masking the triumph in her eyes. Sarah Johnson stood in John Smith's office, tears streaming down her face as she desperately tried to explain. Mr. Smith, I swear I never took that bracelet. I would never steal from you or this house. Her voice cracked with emotion, hands trembling at her sides. John paced behind his mahogany desk, running his fingers through his hair. The wealthy estate owner looked exhausted, dark circles under his eyes betraying sleepless nights spent worrying about his son and the troubling accusations. I want to believe you, Sarah, he said finally, his voice heavy. You've done wonders with Michael that no one else could achieve, but the evidence... He gestured helplessly toward the gold bracelet sitting on his desk, glinting accusingly in the afternoon light. Someone is setting me up, Sarah whispered, wiping her tears with the back of her hand. Please, give me time to prove my innocence. John sighed deeply. I need to think about this. For now, you can continue your duties, but... He couldn't finish the sentence, the implication hanging in the air between them. Trust, once broken, was difficult to repair. Thank you, she murmured, though gratitude was far from what she felt as she left his office. Alone in the grand hallway, Sarah leaned against the wall, trying to compose herself. The mansion that had once felt like a sanctuary now seemed to close in around her. The staff avoided eye contact when they passed, and whispers followed her everywhere. Quite the performance in there, came a cool voice from behind. Sarah turned to find Jennifer Davis approaching, her designer shoes clicking rhythmically against the marble floor. The therapist's face was arranged in a mask of concern, but her eyes glittered with triumph. I know what you're doing, Sarah said quietly. Jennifer stepped closer, lowering her voice to ensure they wouldn't be overheard. Do you have proof? She sneered, her professional facade slipping momentarily. Because without it, you're just the maid who betrayed everyone's trust. Sarah's heart sank. She had nothing, no evidence, no witnesses, nothing but her word against a certified child therapist with impeccable credentials. Michael knows the truth, Sarah replied, clinging to her only hope. Jennifer laughed softly. A nonverbal autistic child? That's your character witness? She adjusted her expensive blazer with manicured fingers. I'm only trying to protect this family from someone taking advantage of their vulnerability. As Jennifer walked away, Sarah felt utterly alone. The chauffeur passed by without acknowledgement, and even Mary, who had once been kind, hurried past with averted eyes. Only the certainty of her innocence and her genuine concern for Michael kept her from walking out the door, never to return. 7 days had passed since the bracelet incident, each one more suffocating than the last. Sarah Johnson continued her duties throughout the mansion, scrubbing floors that suddenly seemed endless and dusting shelves that multiplied before her eyes. The once friendly atmosphere had curdled into something toxic. Mary no longer saved her a portion of fresh-baked cookies, instead averting her eyes whenever Sarah entered the kitchen. Robert offered sympathetic glances from across the hall, but even he maintained his distance, unwilling to be associated with the suspected thief. The whispers followed her everywhere, hushed accusations that fell silent when she turned corners. I heard she's after his money. One voice would murmur. "Poor little Michael is just being manipulated," another would respond. Only the 7-year-old boy himself remained unchanged in his affection. When Sarah entered his room each morning, Michael's eyes would light up with recognition. He would reach for her hand, his small fingers wrapping around hers with complete trust. These moments were islands of peace in her stormy existence. But Jennifer Davis was determined to poison even this sanctuary. The therapist had taken to spending extra time with Michael, using her professional access to undermine Sarah's connection with the child. When Sarah approached the playroom one afternoon, she overheard Jennifer's voice, low and deliberate. "Everyone who loves you eventually leaves, Michael. Your mother left, didn't she? And Sarah will leave too. They always do." The boy's distressed rocking increased as Jennifer continued her psychological assault. "She doesn't really care about you. No one stays forever." Sarah's hands trembled as she pressed them against the wall outside the room. The cruelty was calculated, designed to break the fragile trust she'd built with the child. When Jennifer finally left, Sarah found Michael huddled in the corner, his eyes vacant and fearful. That evening, John Smith passed Sarah in the hallway without acknowledgement, his shoulders stiff with unresolved suspicion. The weight of isolation pressed down on her chest, making each breath a conscious effort. In her small quarters, she unfolded a piece of paper where Michael had drawn a red heart, his silent communication of affection. The mansion that had once offered hope now felt like a prison of whispers and cold glances. Sarah clutched the drawing to her chest, tears streaming down her face. She couldn't abandon Michael to Jennifer's manipulations. Yet every day the psychological torment grew more unbearable. The walls seemed to close in as she wondered how much longer she could endure being the villain in someone else's carefully constructed story. Saturday morning dawned with an unusual stillness over the Smith estate. Jennifer Davis had been planning this moment for days, waiting for the perfect opportunity to execute her final devastating move against Sarah Johnson. While John Smith was occupied with business calls in his office, and Michael was having his morning therapy session with Robert, who had taken to spending extra time with the boy, Jennifer slipped into the west wing of the mansion. Her footsteps echoed softly as she approached the door that remained perpetually closed. The sanctuary of John's late wife. The room was exactly as she had left it. Photographs in silver frames, perfume bottles arranged on the vanity, and the jewelry box that John couldn't bear to empty. Jennifer's fingers trembled slightly as she lifted the ornate lid. Inside, nestled on black velvet, lay the diamond necklace, a family heirloom worth more than what most people earned in 5 years. "Perfect," she whispered, lifting the necklace and watching how the morning light fractured through each stone. She tucked it carefully into her pocket and closed the box, making sure everything appeared undisturbed. The staff quarters were empty at this hour. Jennifer moved quickly to Sarah's small locker, picking the simple lock with ease, a skill she'd never admitted to possessing. She placed the necklace deep within Sarah's spare uniform pocket, making sure it was visible enough to be discovered, but hidden enough to appear deliberately concealed. When Sarah returned from grocery shopping with Mary, Jennifer was waiting in the main hall, her face a perfect mask of concern as she approached John. "Mr. Smith," she called out, her voice carrying just the right note of urgency. "I need to speak with you about something disturbing." John looked up, his expression weary from another sleepless night worrying about his son. "What is it now, Jennifer?" "I noticed the door to your wife's room was slightly ajar," she said, her voice dropping to a respectful murmur. "I checked to make sure everything was in order, and—" She paused dramatically. "The diamond necklace is missing." Sarah had just entered, carrying bags of groceries, when Jennifer pointed directly at her. "I think we should check Sarah's things." The maid's face drained of color. "What? Why would you—" But John was already moving, his grief transforming instantly to rage. When they found the necklace exactly where Jennifer had planted it, Sarah's desperate denials crashed against a wall of damning evidence. "I would never take anything from you or Michael," Sarah pleaded, tears streaming down her face. "You have to believe me." John held the necklace in his trembling hand, his wife's most precious possession, and looked at Sarah with eyes that had gone cold. "I trusted you," he whispered, the words falling between them like stones. The entire staff gathered in the grand foyer of the Smith estate, their faces a mixture of judgment and pity as John Smith delivered the verdict. Sarah Johnson stood motionless, her eyes fixed on the marble floor, hands clasped tightly before her as the accusations of theft hung in the air like poison. "I trusted you with my home and my son," John said, his voice cracking slightly despite his attempt at firmness. "I cannot have someone who steals family heirlooms under my roof." Mary turned away, unable to watch, while Robert stared at his shoes, conflict evident in his slumped shoulders. No one spoke in Sarah's defense. The diamond necklace, Jennifer Davis's planted evidence, had sealed her fate beyond question. "You have 30 minutes to collect your belongings," John continued, his businessman's composure returning. "Robert will drive you to the bus station." Sarah lifted her gaze, meeting John's eyes with quiet dignity. "I would never betray your trust, Mr. Smith, or Michael's." Her voice was steady, despite the tears threatening to spill. "Someday you'll understand that." From the second-floor landing, Michael watched the scene unfold. The 7-year-old pressed his small palms against the window overlooking the driveway, his breath fogging the glass as Sarah emerged from the mansion 30 minutes later. She carried nothing but her weathered canvas bag, the same one she'd arrived with 8 weeks earlier. The boy's face contorted with anguish. He slammed his hands against the glass, over and over, his silent world erupting into guttural sobs that echoed through the cavernous halls. Jennifer stood nearby, her face a mask of false concern as she watched her plan reach its cruel conclusion. Sarah paused at the end of the driveway, turning back toward the massive house. She spotted Michael in the window and raised her hand in a small wave, tears finally streaming down her face. The boy's desperate pounding intensified, his small body convulsing with grief as the only person who truly understood him walked away. That night, darkness descended upon the Smith mansion in ways that transcended the setting sun. Michael refused dinner, then breakfast the following morning. By afternoon, he had retreated completely into himself, rocking in the corner of his room, eyes vacant and red-rimmed. John sat alone in his study, a glass of whiskey untouched before him, the weight of his decision pressing down like a physical force. Something about Sarah's final words haunted him. The certainty in her eyes. The mansion that had once felt like a prison of grief after his wife's death now felt infinitely worse, a tomb where hope had briefly flickered before being extinguished completely. 3 days after Sarah Johnson's departure, John Smith sat alone in his study, nursing a glass of whiskey as rain lashed against the windows. The mansion felt emptier than ever. His son's condition had deteriorated rapidly. Michael refused to eat, barely slept, and had retreated further into himself than before Sarah had arrived. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. Mary entered, carrying a folder. "Sir, I found these under Michael's bed while cleaning," she said, her voice tinged with uncertainty. "I think you should see them." John opened the folder to find dozens of crude drawings, created with desperate, frantic strokes. Each page told a story. A woman with long hair, unmistakably Sarah, holding a child who could only be Michael. But what caught his attention was another figure, dark and menacing, depicted hiding colored objects. In one drawing, this shadowy person stood near Michael with angry lines radiating from her mouth. "My God," John whispered, his hands trembling. The realization hit him like a physical blow. His son had been communicating all along, in the only way he could. He spread the drawings across his desk, arranging them chronologically. The story became clearer. Michael had drawn Jennifer Davis taking the flashcards, whispering to him and making him upset. The child had been trying to tell the truth while everyone dismissed him. "Get Robert," John instructed Mary. "Tell him to bring my car around." 20 minutes later, John was at Jennifer's apartment building. The therapist wasn't home, but her vehicle sat in the parking lot. John hesitated only briefly before trying the car door. Unlocked. He searched frantically, checking under seats and in compartments. In the glove compartment, he found them. The handmade flashcards Sarah had created. The red heart, the happy face, the sad face, the house, the car, all exactly as described. They were slightly crumpled, but unmistakable. John sat motionless in the driver's seat, clutching the cards as rain drummed on the roof. The evidence was undeniable. Jennifer had deliberately sabotaged Sarah's connection with Michael out of professional jealousy. She had manipulated his son, planted evidence, and destroyed the one relationship that had brought Michael back from the edge. Rage and regret coursed through him in equal measure. How could he have been so blind? How many times had he dismissed Michael's distress as part of his condition, rather than a desperate plea for help? John started his car, the flashcards secure in his pocket. This wasn't over. He would uncover every detail of Jennifer's deception, no matter what it took. For Michael, for Sarah, and for the truth that had been hiding in plain sight all along. John Smith couldn't sleep. The suspicion that had been growing in his mind demanded action. After finding Michael's drawings and the hidden flashcards, he knew he needed irrefutable proof of what was happening in his home. The next morning, he contacted a security company who installed tiny cameras throughout the mansion, focusing on areas where Jennifer Davis spent time with his son. 3 days later, John sat alone in his office, his hands trembling as he reviewed the footage. What he saw shattered any remaining doubt. The therapist, the woman he had trusted with his son's fragile mind, was deliberately tormenting Michael. In one clip, Jennifer squeezed the boy's arm until he winced, her face twisted with malice. "This is what happens when you care about Sarah," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "She's gone because of you." In another recording, Jennifer showed Michael a photograph of Sarah, only to tear it up before his eyes. "She never loved you," the therapist hissed. "Nobody does." The 7-year-old's silent tears were more damning than any scream could have been. John's grief transformed into white-hot rage. He compiled the most disturbing clips onto his smartphone and drove straight to the police station. The officers watched in stunned silence as the evidence played out before them. Within hours, they had issued an arrest warrant. When the police arrived at the mansion, Jennifer was in the middle of a session with Michael. The chauffeur stood nearby, watching with newfound suspicion. Mary hovered in the doorway, her earlier doubts about Sarah now shifting toward the therapist. "Jennifer Davis, you're under arrest for child abuse and psychological manipulation," the lead officer announced, stepping into the room. The therapist's face drained of color. "This is ridiculous. I'm a certified professional," she protested as they handcuffed her. "John, tell them, I've only been helping Michael." But the estate owner stood firm, his expression stone cold. "The cameras don't lie, Jennifer." As the police escorted her out, the staff gathered in the foyer, their faces etched with shame and regret. Robert wiped away tears, while Mary covered her mouth in horror. They had all believed the lies, had all turned against Sarah without question. "We should have known," the cook whispered, her voice breaking. "The way Michael responded to her. We should have trusted what we saw." John nodded grimly, already reaching for his car keys. There was someone he needed to find, someone who deserved more than just an apology. John Smith drove his luxury sedan through the modest neighborhood, his heart pounding as he approached the small apartment complex on the city's outskirts. After weeks of searching, he'd finally found Sarah Johnson's address. The weight of his mistake pressed down on him with each step toward her door. When Sarah opened it, surprise flashed across her face. Her mother appeared behind her, protective and wary. John immediately dropped to his knees on the worn welcome mat, unconcerned about the curious neighbors peering from their windows. "I was wrong," he confessed, his voice breaking. "Jennifer manipulated everything. We found the flashcards in her car, and the security footage showed what she did to Michael." Tears streamed down his face as he continued. "He hasn't eaten properly since you left. He misses you terribly." Sarah's eyes filled with tears, but she remained silent, her arms crossed defensively. Her mother placed a supportive hand on her shoulder. "I don't expect forgiveness," John continued, "but Michael needs you. Not as our maid, never again as staff, but as someone who understands him like no one else can." Before Sarah could respond, a car door slammed behind them. She looked past John to see Robert helping Michael out of the vehicle. The boy stood frozen for a moment, staring at her with wide, disbelieving eyes. Then something miraculous happened. "Sarah," Michael whispered, his voice raspy from disuse. It was barely audible, just one word, but it shattered years of silence. The chauffeur's jaw dropped. Sarah covered her mouth in shock, tears flowing freely now. John turned to his son, stunned beyond words. Michael ran to Sarah, wrapping his arms around her waist. She knelt and embraced him, both of them crying. "You spoke," she whispered against his hair. "You spoke, Michael." 3 weeks later, Sarah moved into the Smith estate, not to the staff quarters, but to the guest house. She worked with Michael daily, not as an employee, but as a special needs advocate, helping him find his voice through art and the flashcards they'd recreated together. Mary prepared celebration dinners when Michael spoke new words. Robert drove them to therapy appointments, beaming with pride at each small victory. The mansion, once cold with suspicion, grew warm with laughter and hope. 6 months passed, then a year. Michael's progress astonished everyone. John and Sarah's friendship deepened into something more, built on mutual respect and their shared love for Michael. On a warm summer evening, as they watched Michael playing in the garden, John reached for Sarah's hand. "You saved us both," he said simply. Sarah smiled, squeezing his fingers. "No, we saved each other." The Smith home was whole again, not perfect, but healing. A testament to second chances, to trust rebuilt, and to the extraordinary power of a child's heart.